Hey everybody, this is Chris Morrison and welcome back to the channel. And one of the things that we are interested in doing here is having some very practical conversations about hard theological and philosophical issues. And when you get to the core of it, one of the hardest of those kind of conversations is what we tend to call the problem of evil. Arguments for and against God's existence, and even what that means in our lives, can get really abstract in a hurry. Pain and suffering and evil are one of those things that are not abstract. Yeah, we can talk about them in abstract fashions, and we will, but they are just, it's very, very obvious to your life. If you are hurting, there is nothing more obvious to you than you are. And so one of the big questions people have is, again, and we can lay this out in a proper logical form later, but the big question is, honestly, if there is a God who is so good, that God that we believe in, a good God, great God, powerful God, all-knowing, all good, how does such bad stuff happen? And it's stories like this. So this happened right now. This headline is from today. Death toll rises to 9 in Florida condo tower collapse, according to Miami-Dade mayor. This is just happening. This headline is updated in less than an hour ago. This is going on a couple of hours from where I live currently. And so it's a story that I've been watching over the weekend, and it's an absolutely terrible story of there was a building that just collapsed. You can see the picture here. Just this whole thing just collapsed. And the current count, if you look right now, if we go down here in the story a bit, it kind of gives us a 125-foot long trench. Talk about people dying. Here you go. There are currently 4 people who have died so far. Dawn Fang, Antonio Lozano, Gladys Lozano, and Manuel Lafont. And my thoughts and my prayers and my heart goes out to them and their loved ones who are hurting this morning. And in addition to that, 156 more people remain missing as of yesterday. So it's absolutely a tragedy. Well, what happened? Basically, here they are sleeping, and just half the building just falls, just collapses. Of course, one of the first questions people want to know, is how does that happen? So, you read the story, rescuers are responding, and, the governor's making statements, etc. But if you look here, it says authorities are still investigating the cause of Thursday's collapse. An engineer in a 2018 report warned of major structural damage in the condo building. So they knew that 3 years ago there was a major problem. If you go to that link, this is a link over at NBC News. You can see from the same story that major structural damage, they knew about this years before. And here's a quote from the report: failure to replace the waterproofing in the near future will cause the extent of the concrete deterioration to expand exponentially. I'm not going to go through this in great story, but basically what happened, talk about the abundant cracking and the underground parking garage. The 12-story had to do with the waterproofing below the pool deck was a problem. It says the main issue with the waterproofing that it had been laid on a flat structure. It had not been sloped to drain, so the water sat on the water until it evaporated. This was a major error. Basically, it's going to cause cracks, and as it cracks in the foundation, eventually, it's just going to eventually collapse, which is what it did. And as the story continues, ultimately the failed slab in there is the pavers, and this basically caused everything to just come down. Sadly, people who moved in weren't told, apparently, that this was an issue, this was happening. And people have died, and we still waiting to find out what the total death toll will be. So again, thoughts and prayers. And the reason I start with this story is because this is a very practical kind of thing that we face, whether it's, I'm sure you have stories of evil in your life. Could be big evils like this, big evils. I think back to 9/11 when I see a building collapse. We can think about, murders and cancers and heart attacks and strokes, and there's all sorts of things. And the question still is going to come back to, where was God? Where was God? So what I want to do, let's just want to kind of pause. Let's take a quick walk, and let's just have the first of many conversations we're going to have about where was God? What does this say about God? How should we respond? Should we say, maybe we need to redefine what it means for God to be all powerful or all good, or And then do we even need, in the midst of people hurting and they're hurting right now, do they need some deep theological and philosophical assessment? So let's again, let's take a walk and let's have the first of several conversations about this.
So what I want to do is start with a distinction between what I might call the hard question, the philosophical question, the theological question of evil. This is the one that people tend to think is the important one. How is it that a good God could allow these bad things to happen? How can God's goodness fit with his omniscience, fit with his omnipotence? Things like that. This is the logical question. And I want to distinguish between that problem and then the emotional problem, or what I like to consider the pastoral problem. And this, I think, is a meaningful and an important distinction, because as important as the theological problem is, and we need to address it, if you try to address the pastoral question without having an answer to the theological question, it's going to come across as flat. But the important question is the pastoral question. And the reason is because when something bad happens, when a building collapses, when people die, when our loved ones get sick, they get cancer, things of those nature, it hurts, and we don't like it, and it's painful. And it's really the problem of pain. Why does God let this terrible stuff happen? One temptation that we might face is to come up with reasons to explain this is why this happened, as if giving the reason why would make it feel better. I think if we try that route, we're setting ourselves up for failure, because there is no amount of reasoning in the world that will make pain stop being pain. The moment you know why it's happened, it doesn't change the fact that it still hurts. And so if you try to answer this question, the pastoral question, but I think if I just give the right answers, right information, you are going to find yourself in a situation where you're setting yourself up for the impossible. You're trying to suggest that if I get the right answer, I can suddenly feel good about pain. And that's never going to happen. So then, knowing that we're not going to feel good about pain, what do we do with that? I think we need to actually stay on this just a little bit more. I think this is an insight that philosophers and theologians, apologists can miss, and very much to our detriment. What if part of the reason evil is here is precisely because of the pain that it brings? If I touch a hot stove, I learn a lesson pretty quick. Don't touch it again, right? If I bang my finger with a hammer, I learn a lesson really quickly. Got to be more careful when I hammer. Pain is a teaching mechanism. It teaches us not to make the same mistakes again. And it also, in a much broader level, can teach us something that may be so obvious, but maybe it's so obvious only because we've been living in a painful world our whole lives. And the lesson is this: something is wrong. Something's wrong with the world. Everybody has their ideas of whether it's Christianity, whatever, the Garden of Eden, what utopia is like. If we can fix the problems, life would be great. We have the idea of heaven. But the reality is, all of us know that this world is fundamentally broken. You say, well, I don't need to be taught that. Well, maybe the reason you know that is in large part because you grew up with lack and with pain and experiencing evil yourself, and the part of you've experienced it yourself. You've seen it happen to others. This is, I think, a really important point, in that it sets up everything we possibly can or should say about evil and why God allows it to happen, and how evil got set up in the first place. Now, what I want to claim as this relates to the problem of evil is that, first of all, it's not possible to give just the right set of answers that it no longer will hurt to consider people dying and building collapses. That evil is supposed to hurt because God made it that way. But let's just suppose that it could. Let's say that we don't understand this distinction. We immediately jump into the logical issues and we try to address them philosophically. We're going for the goal. Let's say we were successful. Think about what that would mean if we were truly successful and suddenly it's like, oh, it's okay for evil to happen. I'm suddenly going to feel good about it. Just imagine what that would do. You would lose what is potentially the most important reason for pain and evil in this world, which is to show us, well, in the presence of evil, something is wrong. So then the question becomes, what's wrong with the world? And of course, from a Christian perspective, we would simply say sin is the general thing that's wrong with the world, and kind of more generally, it's the absence of God. And in fact, that's just what evil is. It's the absence of God. And so if we were perfectly walking in God's fellowship at all times, we would in fact not be subject to sin. And I think the Bible does teach this as much. In 1 John, it says pretty clearly that if we're born of God, then we don't sin. And there's some debates theologically what that means. I take it pretty straightforward just to mean that if a person who is walking in deep fellowship with God, they're born of God, they're acting like their Father, kind of. They look like their heavenly daddy, kind of thing. They're in that relationship when they don't sin. And so they're not subject to that. It's to the extent that we walk in darkness that evil happens in our personal lives, at least in some sense, and therefore one of the natural results is we tend to suffer. That doesn't account for all evils. And again, we'll talk about some of the ways that account for that in other videos. But for now, I think it's worth noting that what evil in general shows, whether it is the specific evil of a moral failure or the general evil of something entirely nobody's fault, a tsunami or a building collapsing. You know, the people who were in that room didn't do anything. The people who were sleeping the night that fell didn't do anything wrong. They just went to bed, and then next thing you know, they're waking up and things are collapsing around them. Anything wrong. But what that shows is the world is not operating as it should. And if we could somehow answer this question in such a way to take that away, that frustration, that fear, that anger away, then we will have missed the point of the problem of evil. So yeah, when I say evil's gonna hurt, it's supposed to hurt. That's the point. It's supposed to hurt. I don't have any problem saying God created evil. He did. He didn't create sin. He doesn't make us sin, but God brings about calamity. Well, how can you say that? Those are the sorts of things we need to talk about, but I want to talk about them in always this, what I'm called the pastoral context of, yes, it's okay for them to hurt, and I'm sorry they're going through it, and it may not be your fault. And if you are suffering in evil today, it may not be your fault. A lot of what we suffer is not anyone's fault. Some of it is, not all of it is, and it's supposed to hurt. What we thank God for in Scripture is the day is coming when God promises a resurrection, and at that point, the pain really will be dealt with. We don't have a God who is up there in heaven and is totally removed from all this. The Christian story is that God becomes a human, and he lives that painful life along with us, and ultimately dies a torturous death on the cross. He takes this pain on himself, not merely as a substitute for sin, although primarily that, but even to experience the fullness of suffering and death. And then 3 days later, he overcomes that. So the problem of evil is a point that something is wrong, but it takes us then very naturally to the gospel of the resurrection. And this is the hope that we believe, which is that the wrong will be made right. So again, I think, bottom line, it's okay to say it hurts. Let's make sure that when we're addressing the pastoral problem, that a lot of what we're doing is just empathizing and saying it's okay to hurt, and hurting with those who are hurting. Pray with them, weep with them, and when we're hurting, it's okay to ask people to pray and weep with us as well. And then, having addressed that emotional aspect and putting the right context, now let's think about things like, well, what does it mean? Why doesn't God? Does he have the power and in what sense does he not have the power to address things like free will? Those are the sorts of questions we get into next, so long as we are in the right context. And we'll look at that next time. In the meantime, hope you've liked and enjoyed this conversation. Leave your own thoughts down below, and we will continue the conversation soon. God bless.